You're doing great so far.
Thank you. Boy, that makes me feel better. It's such a tough crowd. So kind of, I guess maybe to recap what's been going on with me. So maybe I'll go back to the project, back to the end of the project. 10 years ago, basically about this time is when I kind of started to decrease my time. Greg Forsyth, just reviewing the other day, Greg Forsyth started taking over in the development review meetings and facing up against Mr. Mann and such in those discussions at HSBC. And I was working on the Balancing Act. And so I've made a blog, and I actually put the Balancing Act out here on financial systems education. Yeah. So the chapters I'm going to add, I'm going to add something called postscript. And the chapters I'd like to add have a little bit of history behind it, ERP approaches, MIS risk, multi-perspectives, my minimum cost paper, which I published last year. It took me about 5 years to develop that. Really what happened within IBM in my partner role, I wasn't really tremendously successful doing what we planned in the partner role. I'd become so specialized that the US market wasn't large enough, didn't have enough customers for me to solve the problem on, to be honest with you. You know, there's a lot of, already the infrastructure in most banks in the US have been built out. There just weren't enough customers in the US. So I got transferred to a global role in 2012 and put into a COC, a Center of Competence. Assets, banks by assets. I had meetings and discussions at 25 of the top 50 banks in the world to talk about the kinds of stuff we had done. I said, okay, forget it. I'm not going to go in with any solution. I'm just going to talk to customers about the concepts of what we've done and why it's important. And so I got a number of places that some of them I spent multiple years at periodically, not every week, but you know, at least monthly, often more than a couple weeks a month, where they'd go, that is, yeah, the problem you're describing is exactly the problem we have, and we would really like to solve that problem. So how do we go solve that problem? One of them actually was in the US, a regional bank in the US that worked on with Ahmed and Murph and others. So the problem came down to, after they'd understand the problem, they'd say, great, what software solves that problem? And instead of proposing something, I would say, well, let's figure that out, right? So I ended up with a number of customers doing very lengthy software evaluations and them choosing software, and then me going through and watching them and trying to configure the software. Because, you know, when you take the architecture picture of what the solution might look like, all the vendors could stick products into the boxes and say, yeah, we have this module that does that. So as part of the projects on a couple of them, I said, okay, great, we're going to configure your software to actually do what that box is supposed to do, which is you're going to do accounting rules at a very detailed level, and you're going to keep the detail, and then we're going to use that detail for a bunch of purposes because we're going to keep it that way. The end result of the discussions in most instances, and the work in most instances was, particularly one customer, they chose a package. The module that was supposed to handle all the heavy lifting in the middle, they chose, yeah, we're going to do that. You get the project team involved, and the project team, one of the discussions with them in the midst of their designing session was, oh, listen, the timelines for the project are so tight, and it's so detailed to go get that, it's so time consuming to go get that detail out of those product systems that we're going to take the existing general ledger feeds, we're going to feed the general ledger feeds to the new general ledger, and after we feed the general ledger feeds to the general ledger, then we'll go do that stuff later. Well, it breaks the whole architecture purpose of a single flow, right? You've got all all this stuff getting aggregated into these high-level feeds that goes right to the general ledger. And then the detail shows up later in the data warehouse that has to be reconciled. It's a different booking system and all of that. So even though the software said it could be done, I couldn't get the implementation people to understand why you would do the work of doing it the way we'd outlined.
Wasn't that always the problem? Every project, every problem started out with the cosmic universal view of I want access to all my detailing I want, and then shortly into it turns into a general ledger implementation.
Yeah, and that's quite often.
And that's why.
That's quite often what we saw happen. Right? Now, it wasn't all doom. Go ahead.
Well, which is why you can't target banks. Right? Because it's always the short term versus the strategic, and the short term always wins.
Yeah.
I know you targeted Amazon
Yeah.
at one point.
Well, so here's you kind of jumping. This
Yeah,
is
sorry.
No, it's good. I mean, let's just go where you just went,
Yeah.
because let's go to the conclusion rather than all the history, right? What ended up happening was my conclusion, after having done this for a while and seeing that the software vendors still didn't solve the problem, my conclusion was the problem sits in the basic fundamental budget of who we were talking to, because the person that owns this problem is the CFO. And the problem is that the CFO's budget on an annual basis is tiny compared to the total problem he has to solve. He has a small number of staff relative to any one of the lines of business, but his systems that he owns, they touch every business transaction in the bank. You know, to what we're talking, in some cases I've told people what we're talking about replacing here, this isn't a heart and lung transplant, this is a heart, lung, and circulatory system transplant, because effectively every business transaction gets accumulated into this thing that the CFO owns, and his budget to ever think about replacing that system, it just will never happen. He just will never have the budget or wherewithal to go change fundamentally the way the basic fundamental structure of the systems work.
Okay. When we get a chance, I want to interrupt the flow. So I think just on this point, I want to come back to the CFO owning the problem. All of IT is now under a guy called, and that person reports directly to the CEO. The first time I've ever seen that structure, and I've never seen that before. It's always been something that goes into the CFO line, and the whole affair of technology. And so we're running a data program. So I'd like to come back to this part of the discussion when we get a chance.
Yeah, no, it's good. That's good. So actually one more background thing, and then we'll kind of go wherever. When I was in a Mexico bank, I was working with Charlie Anderson, a risk guy. He's just a brilliant guy. And there was a lot of downtime when we were trying to get these projects approved, that we were in the office together. And so one day I said, Charlie, can you help me? Can we do a graph to diagram what I'm talking about to prove empirically that there's a cheaper way of building your systems to do that? So I'd get up on the board and I'd start drawing these lines for this graph. And I tried all sorts of things, and Charlie could kind of understand and kind of follow. It took me about 5 years to actually write this paper, which is I put on my blog. A proposed approach to minimum cost for financial systems data maintenance is the title. And I've got very simple graphs in here to kind of describe the problem. And the video I kind of sent out to you, if you went and viewed that, I talked to the high school students this week a little bit about that as well. But what it comes down to is when I finally hit Charlie told me I was looking for an interior minimum cost curve was what I was trying to develop. So I knew what my graph had to look like. I didn't know what would be the accesses on it. This is an isoquant graph. So every leg of this is about producing the same set of reports. So if you take a body of analytical outputs, however many that is, right? And you want it to be a very large body for a financial company of some sort. And if you, in the first instance, you produce all of your analytical reports off of transactions, it can be done, right? If you have all the transactions, you can produce any analytical report you want. But the cost is very high because you're accumulating a lot of transactions to get to that. So if you want something that's a little bit less expensive, you just move one in, and now you use mostly transactions, but you use just a few balances, because balances get rid of the need for transactions. So that reduces your cost just a little bit. Well, you keep moving in on this until you come to this point where you use mostly balances, but there are some reports that balances aren't adequate to solve. And so you have to have, at times, you have to use transactions to do those kinds of reports. That's the minimum cost point, the interior minimum cost. Now, why things happen on this other side is because the number of permutations possible in financial reporting off of a set of transactions can exceed the number of transactions there are in the system. It's a function of the number of attributes in every transaction. And you can set up systems that produce balances on a daily basis that no one ever goes and looks at the balance. It doesn't solve any problem. So you can end up over here where you have systems that are maintaining balances and producing reports, and yet they're increasing the total cost of your environment because you're maintaining more balances and not reducing the total cost. So getting to this point is the key concept. And the point behind the paper is to posit that, in fact, today, that point doesn't require the same kind of general ledger we've had in the past. Because the general ledger was a set of balances you maintained that gave you an enterprise perspective. But if you change the nature of those balances to be much more granular that you're maintaining, like we've done on the FTP system, then you're reducing the total number of balances you're maintaining in the organization. You use transactions when it makes sense, and that gets you to that minimum cost point for maintaining data.
So it seems like the x-axis should be cost of storage, and the y-axis seems to be the number of reports and
It's different permutations of producing reports. So it's producing the same reports under different configurations. But you're right, this is volumes and accesses. Volumes, access, cost, all of that is on that axis. Okay? So where that leads me, Al, kind of going back to the point, is that the fundamental nature of our financial systems and the way they've developed is at the heart of this problem that we're trying to solve. The reason it's done that is because if you go back to cost, this is cost of computing since 1964, and this is the amount of computing. Well, our systems were developed over here. I mean, the basic structure of our financial systems was developed in the 1960s, 1970s, and we're still using that same basic architecture. And when you have that kind of cost, you have to maintain high-level aggregated balances for the enterprise view. There's no other way. When 1 gigabyte of storage here costs you $7 million, there's no way to deploy the compute capacity against the problem unless you highly aggregate. So we're working against a trend that is very old and very long, and it's embedded in all of our business systems, every place in it. That's at the heart of the problem.
So what's your technology spend then? So I understand the compute cost. What's your technology spend?
On this graph,
Yeah.
what I used was, and it's referenced in here, there's a guy that did a very nice analysis of hard disk cost, storage cost. So I used that as the one metric I could find trend analysis on. He started in the 1980s, and he demonstrates, and his source data wasn't public, but I went back to old IBM archives documents, and I was able to link into that when I went back further, and I said, okay, I can see a verifying point here, and there's a lot of other people that use that data. So that's my surrogate for total compute spend.
The blue line.
The blue line is GDP spend in the U.S. on technology, and in the
Tech, not people. Just
technology in 1997, the Bureau of Labor Statistics started accumulating a specific spend on technology. To get something before that, I went back to the IBM archivist, and he gave me IBM financial statements going back years. So this is a little, kind of back here is a little bit of a guess, but you can, it seems reasonable based upon that sample of using the IBM spend and seeing how it grew. Yeah, the first time I heard about blockchain was 4 years ago, and I didn't really pick up on what its implications were until perhaps 3 years ago. I drew this graph this week, which is not based upon, I kept the data over here on technology spend, but I changed it to talk about innovation in ledgers. And based upon going back and examining Luca Pacioli's Principles of Arithmetic in 1494 in the British Library a year and a half ago, and doing a whole series of videos about that, our systems today, the way accounting works, it has not changed since 1494. So this is ledger innovation here. And maybe we've got just a little bit of change that has happened in the last 50 years, but by and large, our systems for ledgers, the way ledgers work, has not changed in 500 years. Rick's been around for a good portion of that, am I wrong? No, but is that accurate, Rick? I kind of made that graphic up.
Yeah, last night, Ahmed's daughter told me how she had she's in 10th grade, she just completed her first post-adjustment trial in her accounting cycle. And so, and it really, the accounting cycle was just what he described back then.
We haven't changed 500 years. And then with the high school students, I took them through, I said, let's talk about the change in your parents' life from technology around communication. Can you give me examples that have changed in your parents? Texting, video chats, just everything. They could just go on and on and on. And I said, okay, let's talk about ledgers. Some of your parents' life. So here's what I did. No, I was impressed. They seemed to be following. So this was the graphic I showed them. I said, listen, if you go back 40 years, everybody used to maintain a personal ledger of some kind. It was written in your check register, right? And the bank had the physical had another ledger, but the only time you knew what your position was, because you didn't have an internet connection, is when you went to the bank, or once a month, you get a statement. So I talked to the kids about errors that creep into that sort of system. What don't you know? And they got them all, right? Oh, you transpose something. You're off by, you write $30 and it's $300. And you lose a check. You don't write down a check in. If you're not keeping this, you have no idea where you're at. So the change we're seeing in the world over the last few years, that there are a few bumps in that graphic I showed, is that, then Quicken, right? was something that a lot of people used for maintaining, instead of doing it paper-based, they started doing Quicken. And you had automatic download. Okay. So a year ago, this month, Carrie and I decided we needed to change the way we've done personal finances. Carrie has done Quicken since 1992. We decided to go away from Quicken. I recently went and I exported from Quicken. I had to install old versions of Quicken to be able to export, and I could not get 1995 and 1994 and 95 data out. I lost it. But I have consistent data Carrie's done from Quicken exported to a spreadsheet. With all my international travel, she made multi-currency accounts to keep track of my Hong Kong dollars and my Singapore dollars and my pounds, and she would do intercompany, she'd do currency translation for transactions. So it was she did very sophisticated. In the course of about 10 minutes a year ago, I followed one of my daughter's leads, and we signed up for mint.com, okay? You log into Mint. In Mint, you say, I have a bank account at this location. You give them a URL. Here's the username. Here's the password. Within 10 minutes, I had loaded the 5 different accounts where I had financial data stored. And within another 5 or 10 minutes, I had a consistent view of all of my data, my ledger, within 10 minutes of having logged onto the website for the first time.
Hey kid, have you heard of concentration risk?
Go ahead.
As in Mint.com, the biggest issue is that it knows everything about a
That's right.
So keeping that one, if they hack into Mint.com, they can hack into everything.
You're right. No, it's a risk. It's a risk. You're right. There's other services too, but they don't protect you either, right? Like Personal Capital is another one that does this. Okay, but what's the change that happened then? What's the technology change that happened when I did that in 15 minutes? What did I do?
From your laptop to the cloud.
Well, a little bit, but it's more fundamental than that. I did away with a personal ledger. I no longer have a personal ledger.
You don't keep it in. You don't keep a checkbook ledger any longer.
No. Why?
Well, you can't look at that all the time.
Yeah, I can.
But I mean, the checks don't always clear immediately.
Okay,
if
but
you have to write a check.
But they clear within a few hours of being deposited. I mean, the gap in, yes, if my balance were so low that any one check was in danger, then I might have to do something different. But if my balance is large enough to give me float of 2 or 3 days, I have no need for a personal ledger of any kind.
So are you still using
I've never
checks?
found the need.
Yeah, I still the guy that mows our lawn, he doesn't take anything but a check. And that's about the only thing.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
on Mint.com, when it sees an amount of $30, it knows what it's to.
How does it know what it's doing?
I set the rule. I set it up. I told it after the first time, hey, when you see this amount,
Yeah.
you categorize it this.
Yeah.
The thing that Mint.com added, the one piece of data that is not stored in any one of those company ledgers is a category.
Yeah.
Category is your chart of account. That is the only thing that Mint.com saves for me personally. That's the only part of this whole system that's a personal ledger, is that one field called category. And it guesses at that, and it gets it right 80-90% of the time. But that's the only piece of data that Mint.com owns that isn't in all of these other systems. Okay, so what does that mean? What does that mean? Well,
In your mind, I mean, if you start seeing transactions coming through you don't recognize, in your mind you're going to, in the personal case, Julia was mentioned, everything that comes through, she recognizes, she picks it up, puts it in quickly, but if she had been, what she'd do is she'd go down there and say, yeah, I recognize all
So I re-registered my cars last week. I told Carrie that the state of Texas told me they'd give me $1 discount if I did it online rather than writing them a check. So I did it online. Yesterday she said, "Hey Kip, we've got $2 charges on Mint." I went and looked at them, state of Texas. Oh, they charged me a processing fee. I didn't know. But just like you said, I identified, oh, yep, I had things happen here, so I'm not feeling like I'm out of touch with my system and knowing what my transactions. I've got complete visibility to what they are. And because I've taken so much time out of the data entry side of things, which used to take huge amounts of time for Carrie, it now has reduced dramatically our personal cost on financial management.
But your business control process is that you know in your head what's going on. So in your head is this transaction ledger, and then you look at Mint and the line that gets light, a lot of something doesn't pop up. If you've got a bigger business problem, then nobody's going to recognize you. You have to rely on some other process to make sure that these are authorized transactions. And that other process is wrapped around your...
Okay, so you just started using key word there, which was business. Right? I'm not really, this is my personal finances. Okay.
I can't help but think, you're just thinking down the road, you know, we're looking at a cashless society. We're not clearing paper items anymore. It's all real time. Everything's just a giant ledger entry.
Okay.
That's, you know,
Okay.
everything.
But let's go back to business for a moment. You're right, Devin. You're seeing where this goes, right? Okay, Rakesh showed this graphic last week. This is percentage of companies, percent ERP vendor market shares. Right, you got SAP, you got Oracle, Fiserv, Microsoft. I think this is QuickBooks. Doesn't show up so well, but I think it's QuickBooks. Intuit.
Yeah.
Huh? This down here?
Yeah.
It's called Other.
They have a budget.
It's called
Excel, is that how banks run off Excel?
Okay. Yeah. But my point is that from a business perspective, the chances of doing away with your personal ledger is very difficult, right? You don't have the same opportunity right now, and there's a lot of reasons for that. One is going to be complexity control. Another reason is going to be concentration of risk on where are my ledgers and having my own, I lose my internet connection or the bank cuts me off and all of a sudden I've lost all that history. Another one's going to be regulatory. The IRS shows up and they want to see my ledgers. They don't want to go to the bank or the credit card. They want to see my books. I've got requirements on my books, right? Okay, in the video, I talked about blockchain, the next generation, and I said, listen, if we do a simple transaction, a vendor transaction, and you think about all of the work that goes on around recording that, when a customer wants to order something, they cut a purchase order, and they send that. Maybe they use EDI, right? But if they don't, they send a paper version. This vendor's got to enter it into his ERP system. Then this ERP vendor ships the goods, and they've got to get the goods. Well, they also will ship a bill of lading, and the bill of lading's got to get entered as a receipt of goods on this side in the ERP system. This company then cuts a check, sends it to here, they deposit the check, So now we've got, we're now up to 8 transactions. Then this one provides a customer statement. We've got a customer statement here. We have to do reconciling to the bank accounts and reconciling to the vendor. If you could share the ledger, those 10 plus transactions would become 3 things. You'd have a 60% reduction in transaction cost. So to kind of net it down, Al, to your point, my 10-year journey has helped me to conclude that the CFO is never going to have the budget to transform is the basic way our business systems function today. It's too costly, and no one will undertake that. What you have to have is you have to have a cost savings that comes somewhere for doing it. Well, if you can start, if the whole blockchain then craze, which is crazy, and I can talk to you more about why blockchain will never scale and the errors they've made in designing that. But if you could share a ledger, not use blockchain, but actually share a ledger, you can start to fund out of a 60% reduction in transaction cost, you can start to fund a lot of transformation of how systems work.
It's the same ledger
It's the same ledger.
across, well, even industry types.
It's exactly what I'm doing with Mint.com. It is the same ledger.
So would you have a different version of the chart you showed before with the number of transactions? The difference between current state count of transactions and proposed state?
Well, so what would really change in my perspective is that the cost reduction line that I have for compute capacity,
That's
the
always
disk
going to go
storage,
down, right?
that, I think that corresponds, you're making me think out loud here, but in a certain sense, that corresponds, one, on that graphic where I did ledger innovation, when I first had that, I had it called ledger cost per ledger. And to be honest with you, our cost per ledger has remained relatively constant because we're doing the same things that we've always done. What I'm talking about doing here is dramatically changing the cost per ledger curve.
Well, again, I'm trying to mash two multiple versions of the chart
Oh,
to see the
so I need,
difference,
okay.
to see the impact.
No, good.
Right.
Okay, so
Good.
you're going to what the solution might look like.
That's easy to solve too, right?
Well-
so the Mint, they're going to your bank account, brokerage account, blah, blah, blah.
Yep.
And they are pulling those transactions in the Mint.
They do pull them into
And
Mint.
so the Mint is an application
Yes.
that you then subscribe to. And
Yes.
you get your account.
There is a data storage component to Mint. So it is pulling out, and the things that it's sharing, right? The things that it can find common between every ledger are things like date, amounts, payee, right?
It doesn't even have a giant list of vendors as long as.
But you're right, Rick, there is a shared component. So
Todd and I were talking about IBM's federation concept, and if you really had it federated, then Mint would go out to each of those places at a time, and you wouldn't store.
I believe actually that Mint is doing federation as opposed to getting the data, so because that's just a view in that. This is technical implementation probably because I don't think they will be allowed from a regulatory perspective to actually take the personal data and move it into their physical premises.
I think they do, but I don't know that, because
I'm guessing.
Because what I can get access, my bank account only really gives me access to 3 months. So when I first set up Mint, I got downloaded 3 months, and now I can still go back a year ago and find transactions. Pardon me? Mint has been keeping my transactions for a year, and so there's a history now in Mint. Okay, Rick, to your point, yes, last week when I talked to Rick about this shared ledger concept, he kind of went, what? I couldn't quite get his head around it. And I didn't share with you this graphic that I'd already written, right?
Yeah.
But what in prototyping my own shared ledger system, which is what I tried to do the last few months, and I didn't get far enough to actually show you anything but some nifty infrastructure. If you're interested in Vagrant as a system and Play as a web server and Spark, I could show you what I've coded on that. I've got a fairly substantial project in IntelliJ and GitHub that I could show you. But as I was thinking about this a couple of months ago, month and a half ago, I said, okay, let's talk about basic configurations. And you might think about these as the steps of the kinds of things you have to have, right? So in order to set up, well, let me not quite jump there so quick. Let me jump you back to some of these basic slides. This is my little web server that I'm running under what's called Vagrant. Vagrant is a VM, runs on my machine, and I figured out how to create my own web server on there using Play frameworks. And I took and put in I just dropped in the PowerPoint slides because I didn't want to code. I didn't have time to code how these would really work. But my idea was, listen, if you were to start from scratch today and you want to set up a shared ledger, well, let's just think about what I did with Mint, right? Okay, so what I do is you go to a web page and you create a user ID. That's not too hard to imagine doing, right? The next thing you have to do, though, is you have to define, if I'm going to do a business system, I have to start thinking about fields. See, this is where blockchain starts to break down. Blockchain is a blank sheet of paper. And like Rick says, the costly part of financial systems implementation is not getting a sheet of paper, it's deciding what to write on the sheet of paper. That's the costly part.
They call that a canvas now.
Okay, yeah, well, Canvas is, that's so much better than a blank sheet of paper. It makes the point. Doesn't it make the point, though?
It's a canvas.
There's a ledger. In thinking about this presentation earlier this week, I started writing, what are the things you have to have a ledger? Well, one thing you gotta have is you gotta have security. We can talk more about that. You gotta know,
the canvas.
but you've gotta have definition. A ledger has definition of fields and values. Because if you want to do something, you've got to define what are the fields and values. So you start defining what your fields and what the values are for those fields. This isn't too hard to figure out, but the next step then is to start to define a record structure, which is a ledger. I put those fields on record structures and I make my own ledger. Hey, this is the ledger. The next piece of this, though, is that I start to search for people to involve, want to share my ledger with me. And I invite them to say, hey, you want to share my ledger, and we'll do transactions, and we're going to record our transactions in this ledger, right? Then we have to agree, okay, which fields out of those that I defined are ones that we're going to share? Because like my category is not something I want to share, right? But we'll share date, we'll share party, we'll share amounts, you could share currencies, all of those things, you can decide what to share, but the point is that there's parts of the system that are not shared, because you don't share everything that's in your ledger. You get to pick pieces that are not shared. The other piece that blockchain completely misses is it has no idea of a posting process. Posting process creates balances. The only reason we create balances is because it makes compute efficiencies. Machines can get tuned. When you make a balance, you can tune how much compute capacity you use. So on your shared ledger, you get to define what are the posted fields and how often you're going to make those balances, and you can share those balances. You don't have to share them, but you can share those because certain business processes will be more efficient if you share the balance. Settlement is a process.
What you mean is the balance type?
Yes, but I'm talking about a physical, actually one instance of an actual balance I could share. So what are those I'm going to, but you're right, balance types, how often they're created.
Right. I wouldn't share your balance.
No, I could share my balance because like on, let's say,
For viewing.
sharing with the ledger. On my shared transactions between my vendor and my customer, I may choose to share the balance of the outstanding purchase order.
Right.
I may choose to share the balance of the payments I've received netted against the charges I've received. I might share the balances themselves because it gets me to a more efficient business process. The last thing is setting up rules for deciding which things, how do I want to create those posted balances. Okay, you get all of that as a very simple, now it's a little bit simplistic at this point, and I've had some thoughts about how do we make that a little bit more, because the system is not going to start with somebody doing that. For a business system, that's going to take too long. We have too many ledgers out there in the world, to get this system started, it has to start something much more like Mint, where you can log in and view your existing ledgers and automatically populate a shared ledger of some sort.
So, my interpretation now, after you've explained that, is that it's really between two counterparties.
Yes.
They're sharing, and that's the scope.
That's the scope.
Okay.
And my point is, let's talk about security for a moment, because you went there, okay? Blockchain came out of Bitcoin, and Bitcoin was defined as a trustless world, right? So it meant that, you know, I don't know this guy in the orange shirt here, but when I pull out, you know, $5 and I give it to him, we don't have to know anything about each other, and I just transfer value to him. So when the Bitcoin inventors defined Bitcoin, they said we want the world to be trustless. We don't want to have to, if I try to use this to pay this guy, he's got to know who I am, where my accounts are, what my numbers are. I've got to know him to trust him. So they defined that. The fundamental problem Bitcoin made in defining that is that even when I give this guy $5, we don't trust each other, but we both trust the person that issued this. We trust that this person that printed this isn't going to change its format tomorrow. And they're not going to go print so many more of them that it becomes worthless to him the day after tomorrow.
You know we do that.
Okay?
Unless you're
It's-
in Venezuela.
Well, okay, but that's the point. Financial transactions are trusted things. Trust is what makes banking work. It's what makes financial transactions work. There's no trustlessness in financial systems. It's a fundamental flaw at the bottom of Bitcoin, at the bottom of blockchain.
Are you going to talk a little bit about how the economy and marketplace is going to stratify
Well,
over time?
go ahead. No, you explain.
So we're going to end up stratifying into various customer communities, if you will, and then
Yep.
ultimately over time we'll have to go to a different. We're going to have to evolve this view of the ledger. Right?
Yeah, I think that's true. If we go to review,
Okay, before you move on, I mean, between two counterparties, right? Makes sense. But why would we talk about a shared ledger? So fundamentally, ledger in my mind is an internal construct, whether it's my personal finance or my company's personal finance. Why would the counterparty be interested in my entity's ledger?
because
As opposed to a contract, I can understand that they would be interested in a contract transaction between each other, but my ledger is my position.
yes,
Well,
that-
there's the general ledger,
Yeah.
but then there's subledgers, right? I look at this as a subledger transaction. That means that
The transaction, I get it.
this is the common part, right? But then I have my own set of books that is private. If I pull from that because that's my common ledger between that counterpart.
my premise, Tata, is that when somebody produces a statement and somebody reconciles to that statement, you're really reconciling ledgers, because ledgers are posted balances.
But those reconciliations tend to be internal,
No.
outside of
No.
transactions.
No. If I disagree with my vendor over how much they ship to me, my reconciliation's with the vendor. Hey, we didn't get that shipment.
But that is true, absolutely. But it's in the context of a transaction
Sure.
or a contract. So the point is. that
But my balance, it depends on your posting key to the balance. If my posting key to the balance includes contract or purchase order number, that reconciliation is about that purchase order.
And
Right.
it's real time.
If I do netting, my netting can be entities in total.
Yeah.
And it's real time.
But this is your ledgers are not there's fields on your ledgers that are internally focused. In fact, maybe if you think about it this way, because it's a debit-credit relationship in a true ledger, credits are internal, debits are counterparty related.
But if you're on the other side of the transaction, it's just the opposite.
It's just the opposite.
All you're doing is agreeing that the transaction is valid, and then you can both reconcile.
It's all shared. Settlement is a form of reconciliation.
And it's real time. You don't have to do both statement runs once a month.
So from that point, right, if you really take this to the the utmost extreme, if every transaction itself is witnessed done at real time and you've got trust in that transaction with your counterparty, there should be no reason for a ledger.
But that's ignoring the whole analytical purpose. Every analytical
But
process.
why do we do analytics in the first place? Because we're trying to go back and look at trends.
It's because no one is going to understand real-time status. Listen, the whole accounting process, Luca Pacioli is documented by the guy that wrote Quantification, let's see, Measure for Measure. He said Luca Pacioli made nations and enterprises stand still for a moment and be measured. Because our analysis of what's happened, we only do periodically. It's when we issue financial. It's why we do ledgers. It's because we only measure periodically. You got to stand back and say, what's happened over the last month? Did I make money? Did I spend money? Am I going up? Am I going down? That measurement is going to be a periodic thing. It's not going to happen every transaction. Our brains don't work that way. We analyze things periodically, and it's independent from how often the transactions have happened. And that analysis is going to continue that way forever because it's the way our brains work.
I think also that not every accounting transaction is with the counterparty. So
No.
you still have to bring all those details together into your group books.
And you
But
go back
they're
to
fed by these subledgers that are shared. I think that's what I'm taking from.
if you go back to these videos here, I did a series of videos that everyone ignored, no one's watched, but they're on.
We're gonna watch it now.
For the next 2 hours.
Listen, these were from 2 years ago. It's about social banking and social commerce. It's about how the society is going to get stratified in these trusted communities, and you're going to have people. So yes, Rick sent me a link last week of a podcast, the Family Independence Initiative. This guy is a social worker. He's working on poverty, and he's got this journaling system where poor people share their data, and they form these connections with other people in their community, and they find trends of things that are working for people, like buying houses or starting this kind of business or starting that kind of job. And in the middle of the podcast, it's an hour and a half long, the guy says, yeah, we're developing a new credit score system. Yeah, I talk about those videos. We're going to develop new credit scores. We as a group here, we trust each other. So we might form a group if we had business relationships of some kind. And our credit score is going to be based upon our trust relative to each other. It may not reflect the FICO score in the world because we measure each other's trust in a different way. The problem with Bitcoin was they implemented a trust security model based upon encryption and having a shared ledger that anybody could get to, and it's incredibly inefficient. It will never scale beyond all of these tiny little transactions we could never afford to go automate before. That's the only thing that's getting put on blockchain, is all this stuff that was so marginal that nobody could afford to go automate it. Because everybody has access into this, because it's a trustless system, the system is going to be built for people that do transactions with criminals. And the security model for doing transactions with criminals is very expensive. This security model for a true shared ledger is going to use many more types of security and be much more nuanced for simple things like access. So let's say all of us have our own individual ledgers and we're set up in a business of some kind. My partitioning of my shared ledger will be, I have partitions with every person that I do transactions with, and I do access control. You and I are the only two that have access to that partition. The rest of you guys, sorry, you don't get to see it. Now, if we have five-way party transactions, then we make a partition that the five of us have access to, but nobody else gets access to.
And maintaining those relationships becomes very complex.
It does.
Because people move and things change.
That's right.
organization.
No, you're right, Mark. But for a 60% reduction in transaction cost, do you think you could overcome that? Yeah.
60%.
Yeah, for a 60% reduction in transaction cost, you'll figure out that complexity, won't you? Okay, so that's kind of what this comes down to, right? Is these are steps that might go on. The first thing that you've got to set up is you've got to set up the public user information. And that's going to be on some sort of server that's a shared environment of some kind. Okay? It could be, yeah, it could be cloud, right? It's cloud, but it's going to be, but my domain of access to that is going to be set to be fairly wide. Wherever it is, right? When I get down to, and I've got to have a definition of my ledger that I'm sharing between two parties. Now that becomes something that everybody in the world doesn't have access to. The two of us have to have access to that shared configuration. So we have to have that shared in some way, and the code that goes along with that, right? In blockchain, the chain code is, we implement chain code, so we each get to verify a transaction before it gets stored. We each get to see it. That sort of thing is all part of this. When I get down, I've got to have a dynamic reference data environment. The reference data environment is going to have some portion of it shared for those things that are references of data fields that we share, but there's going to be another portion of the reference data environment that's not shared. My chart of account, my category in Mint, I don't have to share that with anybody. And when you actually get to the physical partitions themselves, you're going to start to get choices of whether you have this sitting all on a universal ledger, and you don't use a physical partitioning of machines to get access to it. You start to make a partition of machine that is for that shared ledger, and we're only two that have access to that cloud environment. It's partitioned in such a way that I'm locking people out of actually the physical environment in some way. And I go clear over to each one of us having our own servers. And I replicate. If I go to this far, then I'm stepping away from the most cost-effective, because now I'm replicating ledger data. But I may choose to do that for security purposes, for backup purposes, for longevity of the environment. I may choose to go to a replicated data environment to share the data.
So what I'm taking away is what you're trying to get at is a mint.com model for a business shared ledger concept. Mintforbusiness.com. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah. It's a true.
Somewhere in the cloud, shared ledgers where two counterparties can come. You can actually do away with the oracles, the PeopleSoft of the world, and just have this on the cloud service offering that you just come there, subscribe, service, software as a service.
Yep.
And use that as the ledger, as the ERP system that can.
What this does is actually do what blockchain has been saying it would do, but it will never do. Because this really is talking about a true ledger, as opposed to a shared set of journals, which is all you have in blockchain, behind a security model that's for doing transactions with criminals.
But the underlying thing of blockchain is security. It's rock solid security.
Well, it's rock solid.
How are you going to secure this thing? Because without the security, nobody's going to come.
No, because I'll use less expensive forms of rock solid security. Security is primary. Let me make that statement, right? The first point in my definition of what you need for a ledger is the first point is security, because you're not going to go write things down that can't be shared. But today's world, I have so many options available to me for getting to rock solid security that doesn't involve encryption that anybody on the internet can look at. I'm going to open up all of those kinds of options so I can tune security to the appropriate cost, so that my 60% savings in transaction volume isn't taken up by 120% growth in compute cost, because the security model is so out of whack. I have to have security. If security takes 10% of my 60%, that's a good chunk. If it takes 20%, okay, that's a lot. But if it gets my security model and encryption takes 65%, well then I'm not gonna do anything because it's gonna be more expensive to end up doing something. But it's dumb to think that when IBM defined Hyperledger, they were smart in that they said, listen, this blockchain thing is crazy. What's going to happen is we're going to define Hyperledger, which is going to define communities of people that will work in this thing. But the dumb thing they did was they picked up that file format that was for a trustless environment, and they stuck it at the middle of this thing that they already could recognize we need a better security model. Well, the file format in there is stupid.
What you just said was you want a group of people to do so. Twice a year, for the last 3 years, I always end up in a conversation about blockchain and what it means, and it goes on. But what comes, and you and I keep talking about it, seems like it comes back to what you really want is for anything with a long series of events in the transaction life cycle. Then what you really want is all the people involved and counterparties working off of one system so that you've got one transaction ledger as distinct from the T account ledger or the sum of balances. That you've got one transaction ledger where everybody's business processes are wrapped around feeding it. So it is the Maersk deal that IBM keeps talking about, where they got all these orders and shipments and deliveries and clearance and ports and ultimately receiving customers and the payment process. But it always kind of comes back to they're building just an application system to go deal with all of the events in the Maersk shipping cycle. And the game is to go host this thing, IBM being the trusted party, and then everybody who's involved in moving all this stuff around the world, from shipping companies to manufacturers to consumers and stuff, they all use that system to go get that problem done. And so when you start talking about cleaning up the reconciliation, I absolutely see all that.
I think the trade clearing would be another opportunity for that, because they're all just interchanging data, they're all doing the same calculations, but it's, they're all booking it separately.
It's not anything to do with the hashing issues related to blockchain. It has to do with a transaction like being recorded in a system that everybody uses.
And to be honest with you, Rick, to your point, even more than a year ago, there's no reason you couldn't use an Oracle application to do this today. If you define your counterparties as security to particular parts, when you do intercompany transactions today, intercompany could be different parties. We do the thing that's different about this ledger than, for example, EDI, right? EDI today is a sharing of data, but there's no storage. EDI is a message. Nobody goes back to the EDI server and adds up all the transactions to get to a position. But all you're talking about is saving in that shared environment those ledger transactions and relying upon them as your book of record.
The thing is, what probably throws me off a bit is, maybe the financial industry is only contracts that have seen blockchain make any really tangible progress. But if you look at supply chain and more in the manufacturing stuff, for example, like perishables and the source of chicken and the source of tomatoes coming from the farm to your table, blockchain has been extremely successful because the number of counterparties, well, not counterparties, but the number of intermediaries who are involved in the process of getting it from the farm to the fork are tremendous, and they don't have one universal system that can track all of this in one shot. So blockchain gives a very trusted way of saying, yep, it went from the farmer to this distribution center to this grocery store to this, then to your thing. And one of
But
the
that's
things-
value. So let me react. There is value in that.
And the value there is about, example, they said the chicken, some academic came out for some, Matt Cow like really cool on the chicken side of this shit, fast product. But I find out that they stop the entire country supply from that country. But if you had blockchain to pinpoint the exactly farmers who actually did that, you would only isolate that and say potentially billions.
It's more about lineage.
Lineage. Lineage is really what blockchain is actually.
But and that's valuable.
In order for those events and that long chain from farm to market
Yeah.
to get recorded in the blockchain, right? Then somebody has to have the whole thing somewhere, because you're adding in the rows and you're calculating the hashes as you add the rows to.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
If
Somebody,
you-
one person has to do that.
somebody's got that. Well, what, for the diamond industry, Rappaport's now got a blockchain
Yeah.
initiative. But when you get down to the bottom of that one, it's still just a transaction file.
It is.
It has all the details about what all the events were, and it's in one physical system.
Great.
Because if you don't have it in one physical system, you don't have a block.
Right.
So,
The point is though, that one system did not need to bring those 10 people to the table to get them all agreed on, okay, you're all going to work on Oracle, we're all going to work on the CRP system, you guys pay up this money.
No. So I'm not suggesting.
There's an independent company that said, we'll track it, you just have to, I'll like mint.com, I'm just going to go into your information factory, get that data, record it, hash it, and by the way,
But
put the whole hashing on the.
They did agree on the fields they were going to store.
Yeah.
They agreed on the structure.
Yeah.
They agreed to give access. You change the nature of the technology they're using from Oracle to blockchain. It's just a change in technology.
I agree. Your mint.com point is very valid because this is the mint.com for business to go record the entire chain across the board.
What it doesn't get to though, what that problem doesn't get to though, it doesn't solve the analytical problem, which is where so much of our business work ends up happening. It's how many eggs came from a particular location. It's what position am I in at this point in time relative to my supply and demand. A ledger was integrated with the reporting process. And blockchain isn't really a ledger, it's a transaction file. It's a transaction store.
call it.
It's not
It's
it's a transaction store.
Complicated linking structure between the web.
Links is basically all.
Yeah.
One,
It's just a transaction store. It's not a ledger, it's not a shared ledger. You could build a shared ledger in it. You could make chain code that does posting. You could agree.
But why do you say it's not a ledger? If you store all the transactions ever from the start of time till now, that's a ledger.
Yeah, but Tata, it's not a ledger because a ledger posts.
Come on, we're all here. We know the JSF.
A ledger post. A ledger post because posting is the process that tunes compute capacity to the analytical outputs on that.
You don't need computing anymore. You've got the cheapest computer available on earth. Google Compute is cheap.
So you can do anything in that.
Yeah, okay. So fine. So, and you're right. So to a certain extent, mint.com doesn't post any of my transactions. It aggregates all the time. On the fly. You're right. For the largest organizations in the world, they will still require posting processes. I'm not solving the small egg producer. I'm solving the problems for the largest organizations in the world. And posting is what tunes compute capacity to get you to balances over time.
So Mike, what's the cost now of BigQuery with BC? It's like some ridiculously low amount. And for each one it's costing what now? Like a couple $100 or something?
Yeah, I mean, I think we switched to BigQuery, so there's costs on keeping the data out. But yeah, the cycle run is pretty low.
Ingress cost, let's keep that aside. But the actual processing cost?
And you do that against the SJEs.
No.
Oh
JSF.
wait. What's the JSF?
It's
It's a posted file.
Yeah.
But I think we gotta differentiate between, there's a ledger, there's the JTF, there's the transactions, and to go deal with the reconciliation issue in a shared environment, you're talking about the JTF. Right? Then you've got the JSF, which inherently squashes time on the volume of transactions for an analytical purpose. And that's what Kip's talking about with the interior minimization of cost. And that's been the starting point for lots of analysis. And so when we talk about the cost benefits of shared ledger from limited reconciliation was one thing, and then the ability to go use that, which blockchain ignored for general purposes over time, is another topic, and that feeds into the right-hand side issues of analytical software and can be all cost now. You're down doing GRC for $200 a month.
It doesn't matter how much you tell me, Tata. If you want to do stuff over here, I will find at some point a cheaper way of doing it here with the posted balance. So,
Yeah, no,
so build it into the
fact
build it
that
into.
using the JSF says that's true.
Yeah, so keep me on for 6 months
Yeah,
now, so
yeah.
you
No, you're
keep me
right,
on.
right. It's JSF, not JP.
It's not JTF, it's JSF, and it's completely denormalized. So massive train of like 400 attributes or whatever,
200
1800 attributes now. Wow. And so we're talking, that itself was that structure that they started off with the rows exploded because there's a lot of repetition in the rows, obviously with the denormalization. We're talking at least, whatever number, hundreds of billions, and that itself was a big query table that was sized in terabytes. And then that starts off and explosions and digital all that.
And I'm not disputing that at all. In fact, my prototype is all on that sort of technology stack. That's what I've been using for proof of concept for 2.5 years now.
So this is interesting. So is there a time dimension to this? When should I achieve intersection?
No, because these are different configurations of the system.
Different configurations, but you're saying the same unit of work for each.
Same unit of work.
Right.
So
into your 60% reduction, does that blue line come
no,
down?
so 60% reduction would be a different graphic. It's not represented on
On this graph, if your cost of computing goes down to zero, then those intersection points are going to change because you can, if the cost of computing is so cheap.
There's not, no, because it would just shift, the lines down. To your point, Al, there is a certain level at which, and it really becomes a memory issue, right? To the extent that my transaction volumes fit within memory, and the unit of work that has to be done is so small, then maybe there's a dimension on this graph over here, which would be good to think about more, where this is very inexpensive.
Very expensive, yes.
But that's trivial problems. I'm talking about very sizable problems that deal with, even my data. I don't know how long. I don't do a lot of analysis on my Mint data. It doesn't give me options of analyzing years and do aggressive analysis over years. I'm limited. It really only does months. So I'm sure it's partitioned by time, and any query that I'm able to do on it, it's picking up a month. But if I want to do yearly analysis over, like I can with my Quicken, my Quicken exported data, that's in millions. I could get the number, but it's into millions of rows for my data from 1994.
Right, but as the cost of computing and the speed of computing increases at the pace it is, then
sure. So
then
in 10 years
between your monthly thing and your
great. So in
becomes-
10 years when we get back together again, we won't have to have this discussion. Over the course of my career, cost of computing hasn't eliminated the need for balances. If it could, balances eliminate, balances add a lot of problems,
Yeah.
because there's a lot of reconciliation that goes on with balances. So I'm not defending balances because balances are good. I'm defending balances because they tune computing to the problem you're solving. That's the only reason you make balances. It tunes the computing to the problem you're solving.
Not to mention there's a bunch of functional guys who only think in balances.
Well, but that doesn't mean you have to store them.
Yeah, you can compute it.
You can compute them.
What
But
I'm hearing you say is the
that-
mindset change is functional folks shouldn't think about balances. It's a technical way we overcome cost issues.
That's a cost, it's purely a cost issue, is the only reason. Now, they're gonna think about balances, you're not gonna change them because our analytical minds, every analytical question starts with a balance.
Right, with the scorecard.
It's a scorecard.
Yeah.
What, where are we at on the track to the project? It's always a scorecard of,
An accumulation of events always.
It always is. there are very few questions that start with a transaction by itself.
That's interesting. Yeah, everything we think in terms of all this is a historical trend of events is we try to make sense of it.
So let's say everyone in the room here says we're going to share a ledger, and we all get a 60% savings in our transactions.
Yeah.
So we have this great system. But then we have these other vendors who are non-participants in the shared ledger.
So
So you have basically a legacy system, and you have to maintain in parallel
You're right.
with your shared ledger the old way. And the guy says, well, now I got to keep people the new way and the old way.
Good. So how will this system start? Because it's probably not going to start. It's a network problem, right? And network problems don't start with the network in place. They have to grow the network, right? So I'm positing that the universal shared ledger would start as a reporting system. It's going to start as a mashup of existing ledgers. That somebody's going to say, okay, I can't go to the CFOs today and say, you should do this, and we're going to rewrite all of your systems. But you could go to the CFO and say, if you start down this journey, you're going to get to 60% reduction, but you're not going to start to get 60% cost savings up front. What we're going to do up front is we're going to start to establish a reporting environment that gets you greater consistency across your ledgers, across your counterparties. So it starts as a reporting system. The next thing is that it starts to allow for entry of new transactions into the system. So the first thing is only extract. The next step is that you start to allow original entry, even if it's just adjustments, into the new repository, right? Then, once you've started to do that, you've started to make a transactional ledger, because you now have the ability to put originating business events into that ledger. Now you start to collect people, and it only has to be you and one other counterparty that agrees to share the ledger. You only have to start one at a time. And you're just making a partition for that counterparty. And so the system grows by counterparty coming onto the system. And that's how the system would end up growing over time, is that people would start to adopt it. In the end, it could become the point about not trusting cash. You could start to do settlement in the system, that you actually then just use credits inside the system as your form of payment. And it actually could get to a virtual currency at some point, but that's way down the road.
First bullet to the last point and talking to Rick about it. Federation is, now it's got a fancy term of data virtualization. That's what the industry is moving towards. Actually, IBM, I was talking to Rob Thomas the other day, they come with a pretty, at least sounds good. It's called ICP, Internal Cloud Platform. It's a container-based approach to basically let the data sit wherever it sits today, in Teradata, Oracle, Exadata, wherever.
Yeah.
It just brings it all in for a view for you to look at it. To look as if it's all been imported and extracted, but the data never moves from where it is. And they can do this drawing on the fly accurately. seen it in action yet. 10 billion rows in Teradata, 10 billion rows on the mainframe can be joined after very quickly presented to you as a report. So that first bullet saying start as a reporting system,
Yeah.
would just be a view.
Yeah, and that's not what, that's what Mint starts as well, right?
So, Tata,
I'm actually asking Rob to come and do that.
Cosmic universal incident.
He solved it. Got a whole lot of that IBM stock if he's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I sold it unfortunately. Yeah.
Okay,
So okay, so in looking at the ledger, you know, we now have our nice shared ledger, and the economy's has stratified and transformed into these various
trust
stratifications.
circles, yep,
of what-
social commerce,
social, yeah.
social commerce circles.
So what does the ledger look like then?
It would be, so the interesting thing that, on the discussion with
What's it based on?
well, on the discussion with the freshmen this year, one of the kids, the last question that was asked, which was a good question, what kind of companies might solve this problem? And I said, well, so there's a bunch of people doing startups on blockchain, but I don't think they're going to solve the problem, right? You download an app from a store and you start to log in to experiment with the app, and it says, please transfer all of your money to this account. Nobody's going to do that because it's going to be a trusted name that has to establish this. I said, could the banks do this? I mean, in a sense, banks provide a data platform already. All their data is digital, and so maybe they could do this, but they don't tend to view themselves as IT innovators, right? They've got a large infrastructure of existing IT products, and changing that has been difficult for them to think about doing. Could it be a Google or an Amazon? Yes, but neither one of them have aspired to be ledger companies, right? I mean, I approached Amazon and had multiple discussions with them because they're closer to a business system than Google is, because everything in Google's URLs for the most part, really. In Amazon, they've got transaction data, but Amazon, to solve their financial system problem, they're implementing Oracle. So they're not building their own financial system, they're implementing Oracle. When I think about those companies and I think about the opportunities for investment, this one is a complex investment, right? Long time to get there. The things that they can invest in the short run to get greater returns are much less complex and risky, and so they're not interested in doing it.
So one thing that comes to mind when we talk about it, you went to talk to Amazon, right? I tend to agree with you and bring back to first point. Banks may be the most archaic thing to go talk to, and they're not IT leaders by any means, right? So there's a book I was reading about this guy called Kai Fu, the artificial intelligence, guru right now. And his point was all about China and what's going on there. In a lot of ways, the US seems to have fallen back in terms of innovation. It's happening a lot of going on in China right now. And Tencent and WePay, these are the companies, and Alipay, these guys have 90% of the payment market in China. And none of them are financial companies at all. They're pure play tech companies, Tencent and WePay. So this is the same thing as Zelle that we've got in the US, that you can just use your mobile number and you can just simply transfer money to me to watch, right? And just do it on a peer-to-peer basis, and two banks can be connected, and these guys have worked it out in a way to get that done. That is an opportunity then. And I talk to those guys because those guys understand technology, and this is fundamentally disintermediating and really saying ERP companies and it's a threat to them in terms of
It's a threat to the ERP companies?
right, and so the Tencent and the WePay may be the target for something like this to take a look at and say that's an IT way of disrupting. What about Apple? I would think they could be a disruptor. Their card is a disruptor, my brother. The Apple card right now.
You can't
fees, no, they're just
do any of it. You can't do any of it without a bank. That's just the issue, right?
Well, that's,
And the thing, they can't do anything unless they're connected to a bank.
No, but I disagree.
Banks-
with them, but what can't we do without a bank? I mean, Tencent and WePay just proved they can do everything without a bank.
Yeah, but where's the cash coming from?
People, peer-to-peer. It's
Yeah,
just-
but the people aren't, well, they're not going down in their pockets to get it. So they've got
So
to go
that's
to
the
their
point.
bank to get
So
it.
the point.
They've got to go to their
Like
bank
for
to
what?
get it. The cash has to clear somehow. But in talking about why focus on banks, and I get, why we maybe temporarily would go look at other things, but banks are the ripest place for this kind of tech. It's where it's needed the most, whether they're going to unask the cash to go do it or whatever is another story. I mean, I just think it's just the place that it's more required. It's just needed. You could push the innovation further in that industry, I think, especially in capital markets. I think.
So that's your challenge, where to sell this? No, I'm serious. No, where to-
Yeah, I mean, the reaction
Sell
here,
it anyway.
the reaction here is quite positive, right? But you guys are all knowledgeable about this problem space, right? But that's the problem is, it's either one, you're talking to people that really don't understand what a ledger is, to be honest with you, because we automated them in the 1970s. And even ERP vendors, guys, most of the ERP vendors have forgotten that they have ledgers at the bottom of their systems. This whole thing was automated so early, and the body of people that know what ledgers are is very small, such that most people think blockchain is a ledger. They accepted that term widely. But, and so they should have been, somebody that knows a ledger should have been able to call them on it early, and you would have looked like an idiot calling blockchain a shared ledger, because it's not a ledger.
I bet 50% of the people in our blockchain practice right now would say that it's a ledger.
Yeah, it's a transaction store.
I mean, technically, it's a distributed ledger. is what they call it as a
Yeah.
ledger.
That's what they
It's
call
Well, that's what I'm
the same-
talking-
Everybody's got the same copy of transactions, plus and so on.
But it's not really a ledger, right?
But,
So
yeah, so
the point is that, so part of the problem is not just it's an education issue, which my vlog hasn't really solved, but it's tried. But yeah, I'm still. So what I've been doing, to be honest with you, for the last, well, let's come back just the last 2.5 years, I decided that I was tired of talking about these sort of slides with people who at the end of it would say, give me 5 more slides. Just give me 5 slides. And, I'm not going to educate you with 5 slides about what a ledger is. So I said, I've got to try to build something on my own that people could react to. And that's kind of what I've been trying to do, but my ability to write what we're doing. But it's useful. I mean, the summary you're getting within this sort of discussion is the culmination of that sort of rigorous thinking day in and day out at my screen, trying to say, what am I going to try to code here to make it work? So I've been working a little bit more on the prototyping sense to give somebody who's not so steeped in it a feel for what it would look like, so that then it becomes less of a... The other problem also is that the world of software has changed, right? I've become convinced in the last couple of months that open source software is ultimately going to win. It will win because of the number of developers on the platform.
What is the structure of the ledger in the future?
Well, so I think it kind of depends on the scale at which you're using it. Okay, I'll give good. Here's what I've tried to code. That you have the metadata, ledger definition. I kind of was going to generating code for your ledger, but instead of trying to dynamically, like Saffir does it today, that I would make it more simple and we would generate ledger code based upon that definition. Now, Rick's response last week was, that's pretty undifferentiated to try to think that you're going to go write a ledger. So maybe it's gone too, the feedback from last week was maybe that's not the way, but take that simplistic. You've got the ledger file input, you've got the import process, or you've got, actually an idea here, is that there are open ERP systems in the world. They're not very widely used. There's an interesting one, though, called OFBiz. Oops. It's Apache, and this is an open source ERP system. Has a full set of screens. You can go do, anyway, there's a Vagrant version of this that I could download to Vagrant. OFBiz, Open for Business is what it's. There's a Vagrant version of this that I could install on my laptop, and it has the simple demo version has a Derby database behind it. You can get to the data model for it. My idea was that it would be nice to go prototype and see if I could define a semantic layer. Basically, instead of talking directly to the database, I would create a set of views, and the OFBiz code would talk to those views, but I would reorganize the database in the background behind a universal ledger. Because part of the problem also in the world that I'm talking about, if you really want to solve the analytical problem, the disparity of all the ledgers for every business process is a problem, right? Because everybody, at the end of the day, they want to see purchases against receipts, against shipments, against sales. And all that ends up doing is we've got to go build a data warehouse to bring these different data structures together. Well, in fact, you did a universal ledger, which we did. Then you could store that data in a consistent structure across every business process. And I do away with the whole integration environment for the data warehouse because I have this data in a consistent structure right up front. So my universal ledger would be very much around the JSF, JTF arrangements structures. It would have that sort of characteristic to it. And I'd like to prove at some point that I could do inventory-based processes in that as well. That I could keep not just quantities of dollars, I want to be able to keep quantities of inventory because so many of the business processes require inventory quantities as well. But I think it could be done.
Given the strategies that are going forward in the economy, the answer is that the ledger then becomes a customer.
It becomes a universal ledger at the customer contract ledger, the vendor level, the item level, whatever the business process is. So if you're going to take this OFBiz thing and define the database behind it, you define a universal ledger that you try to bring together purchasing, payments, receivables into the same ledger structure, but have the screens operate off against that. Yeah.
But that's really the forward-looking answer.
Yeah.
And
You want
those
if you're going to start down this road of transformation, if you're going to use that 60% savings, then go solve that problem as well because you'll get savings out of that. You're spending today that I don't even have to put in the business case by all of your integration work that goes on at the back. So then the next phase of the process is ID assignment, because you got to have, unless the IDs are entered from the front end screens, if the data is coming from someplace else, I've got to have consistent IDs. We do that today. You've got to do accounting rules because you got to get to debit credit representations on things. So there's internal representation, external representation. This would be part of the transaction. If I'm doing file import, then this is an import process. If it's part of an actual universal ledger that I'm sharing with someone else, it's a real-time thing where I'm doing the accounting rules at the time that somebody's doing the transaction. I've got to have a potential posting process unless my compute capacity goes to 0, and then I don't have to do that, right? But this is all about doing the financial processes like multi-currency, reclass, all of those things, and I've got an analysis phase. That's what the basic phase is, but you all know that because that's the system we built. That's, yeah.
Yeah, take a typical bank. I mean, do you have any idea how many counterparties you have?
You know what? If I partition the counterpart, this becomes a silly cloud-based problem because I'm partitioning every counterparty relationship in its own partition. So no matter, it doesn't matter how many they have today, their systems handle that data today, and I'm going to have the same data tomorrow. I'm not increasing the data volumes.
No, I know. But I'm thinking about how many
So customers for
outside parties do I have to have some sort of agreement with to make this thing work and make this?
I could make it with
maybe
one.
It's only 10% of the.
No, I could make it with one. I can get the savings if I just have a single counterparty because the 60% savings comes from sharing data with that counterparty. But I don't have to have a network effect. I only have to have one to start to get the 60% savings on that set of transactions.
There's one other thing, multiply that. Multiply that.
Yeah.
Multiply the 20 million, 30 million, which at least for 20, 30 million customers. And maybe I need an agreement with or the ability to do 5% of that 20 million to get close to your 60%.
No. My point is your 60% savings comes on each party you bring on.
Oh, okay.
Because you're doing transactions with that party,
Okay.
right? I don't have to have it's a single party savings. But it's a radical change for the thinking of our business systems because I'm collapsing your data warehouse, your general ledger, and your operational ledgers. Because to get to a shared ledger, you have to bring those together in a consistent way.
So the other, I guess, challenge I see that maybe the issue, I guess, to work out is, what is the cost? I mean, is it really the biggest problem the CFO has right now in his charter that the financial systems cost is the most burning thing that they're trying to go solve?
No, he can't. Yeah, even if it is his biggest problem, his budget will never solve that biggest problem.
Well, if it is his biggest problem, then maybe they'll invest into it. But if it's not directly, because how
To your point, Dada, it's still a problem as to who buys this, right? Who do I go to in any organization to talk about this? Because I'm talking about operational ledgers, I'm talking about financial reporting, I'm talking about analytics, right? So the CFO doesn't own the operational ledgers. It's still a problem as to, I don't know who to go talk to say, you should start this process. Maybe the COO, perhaps, but it's still a difficult part of how to have this discussion.
And keeps going marketing, 360 degree view and customer cross-sell, upsell. And this is the whole foundation of it. And you add the attributes, the marketing, and the sales, and right, all of that. And that's the top line, right? They're going to grow their revenue that way. So they'll make the investment, but it's a big investment.
Well, the problem with marketing is that the data standard for marketing tends to be fairly low, right? And the data standard we're talking about here is book of record standard. So it's a significant cost over what they've ever done previously.
They struggle with timeliness of data, right?
And accuracy.
Feeds, it's all old.
You know, that's interesting that you bring that up because this horrible client that I'm working at right now, they're actually trying, they hired a consulting firm, it's a little boutique firm, to go out and look at all of the products that they're marketing with for the firm. And then they're trying to drill those products down into the financial reporting products, which will never, ever happen because, to your point, the data quality is so low with marketing. I mean, that changes on a daily basis. They're going to call one thing, and the amazing thing is the inability of the CFO and all of his lieutenants to actually understand it, and the marketing group. And there's nobody, they just have consultants just churning away over this insane exercise, and it's not going to happen. Yeah. And just sitting here listening to this conversation, it's clear to me. So
that's a great point. I think both of them are getting on the same point that maybe the excitement's not there because to your point with the CEO or CFO, underlying financial data is critical. That's a starting point for everything. And I think for the longest time we've been looking at this as a control reg problem.
And we got a long ways down solving it by doing that.
We have.
But it won't get you to the next
But
stage.
pivoting this into how you monetize this and get to a revenue, so the next best offer, I mean, that tends to be the biggest thing for marketing right now is for a bank, how do I get to, can I give Kit Twitchell that mortgage while he's walking down a subdivision?
Yeah.
And he likes that house and I can track his movement on social media, marry it with his credit score in real time and say, boom, here you go, get a 2.9% APR and we can get you this house. That's what, how can you pivot this to that is really the jump to me. Because that will start talking about opportunities on the top line as opposed to a cost.
Well, let me give a little bit of a positive spin. My mind has changed in the last 2 months. I feel confident that I'm over the issues of definition of what the problem is. You've seen a lot of detail today that's come in the last 4 months about, hey, here's the parameters of the problem. Just getting, I do feel very comfortable on that 60% cost savings. I mean, that's a huge number to be able to stand up in front of somebody and say, yeah, if we share this data with your counterparties, you're going to have a significant cost saving. So we aren't yet at the point of marketing because I'm just finishing in a certain sense the definition of what the problem is. But that is the problem that stands out next. Because right now it's a little bit, we've got to scale to a certain extent. It's too small of a group doing it.
In a lot of ways, it's adding 2 more boxes to your flow, right? This is all about the posting of, and you get the customer's view of the balance at the most detailed level. If you simply start to marry the patterns or the social media information of that customer.
Oh, there's a whole bunch in here, right? I mean, this is very simplistic about everything that goes on in that phase. But what I was trying to demonstrate through my prototype is just that I can get to that phase, not having to solve what the problems are beyond
So, Kip, I wanted to point out that it's 4 o'clock.
here. Yeah, thank you.
You can keep going.
No, I'm done. I covered. Randall's got a little bit to it.
So how come IBM's not doing it? You're going to knock on Google's door and Amazon's door and everyone else's door.
Some of
That's
those,
IBM,
if I were to be honest with you, in a certain sense, there's some Safford fatigue inside of IBM. Having heard this story for years, and so there's a little bit of that I think is involved.
But don't you think IBM is putting their head out on blockchain?
Yeah,
Yeah.
but I haven't. My engagement with the blockchain people, as I've talked about this, maybe it's the way I engage in the discussion, but I don't get people coming back to me saying, well, yeah, I want to understand more, or no, you're wrong. It seems that the discussion around blockchain more often is we don't want to take it deeper or learn more about it.
Right.
We
just want to sell.
we just want to sell more of it.
Right. And storage, our storage and our hardware.
And to a certain extent, IBM isn't really. I mean, even blockchain is Hyperledger. It's open source, right? The point about open source is going to win is that there's nobody doing large. They're not doing large package development anymore. People just aren't doing that. The way people buy software has changed, right? Just talking to Rick last week. When you go buy software, you don't buy. Nobody starts by looking at PowerPoint. They download the software. They start using it.
Provision.
So you've got to. So in a certain sense, there's an element here of the market has changed in the way people attack these problems, and unless you build it to a certain extent, and IBM's, their appetite for development of new products, died 15 years ago. They're really not doing new product development.
Yeah, in the first sentence of the quarterly earnings call was blockchain up until about 2 quarters ago. when blockchain disappeared from the discussion. And a year ago, 2 years ago, Shanker was in charge of strategic initiatives for GBS. You couldn't shut him up about blockchain and what they were going to do, and how this was going to save the world. And last time I saw him in October, he wasn't talking about anywhere near as much as he was 2 years previous. So somehow everybody got into it. They thought it was going to go be all this stuff, and now it seems like they can't figure out what to do.
I think we're struggling too. 2 years ago, they just made a partner, a young partner that was going to head up the blockchain group, and to a lot of they made him a partner to a lot of noise and a big deal about it, and they established the project or the practice and tried to recruit people into it and lots of talk about it for a good 18 months, and now you don't hear anything about it at all. I think we were late to the game.
Maybe the game,
There's no game.
Yeah.
Well, there's no game at all.
It's
Probably.
limited use case. I think scalability is a big challenge. Power requires something from off the and that's like he said, so people who have a compute power actually are able to provide but there are use cases that make sense security perspective that could provide trust perspective, trustless perspective. Yeah, they're limited in use cases. It was deeply anticipated. That's how revolutionary that where that land out.
Yeah, that reminds me of XML. Carla Fiorina was came out in the presentation, and she's going on about XML, this and XML. Carla, she's in there, and Mark Ost is the head of the financial service. Right. And we walk out and launch the slide. He says, Carla, man, she's so technical. I said, just not how I said, I said, it's a markup on the well. I said, what's the DAX party? What are you talking about? And then the high party.